All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Securing Your Workloads with VMware Carbon Black Cloud. My name is Evan Hernandez, and today we're going to discuss how to secure workloads with VMware Carbon Black Cloud Workload. This is a live interactive webinar, so please remember to ask questions. We'll answer questions as we go and catch up with the remainder at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be sent to we'll send everyone a copy of the recording as a part of the follow-up. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Chris Corde. And
thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. So yeah, just running through what we're going to cover today. As it relates to what we mean by securing workloads, it really means securing anything and anywhere that your applications might be running. It could be private cloud, it could be public cloud, it could be containers and modern application frameworks. So we're going to try to cover all of that content today. Obviously, since Carbon Black has become part of VMware, securing workloads in a holistic way is near and dear to our heart. Most VMware workloads run and operate inside customers' data centers. And in many cases, those critical environments tend to be ignored over other environments like endpoints. So we're going to start by giving a little overview of the Carbon Black Cloud, talk a little bit about the features and functionality that Carbon Black delivers for any environment, whether it's endpoint or workload. And then talk a little bit more in depth about the differences in workload security in particular and why providing some purpose-built functionality for workload security and some differentiated functionality alongside VMware tech can be critical for securing your most critical assets. And then I want to walk through securing modern application frameworks as well. We'll actually do the demo prior to that, so this agenda is a little out of order. So we'll do a demo after we talk about workload security, and then I'll dive into how we secure Kubernetes and modern application frameworks, and we'll take some questions. So just a quick overview of Carbon Black. The core thing that powers Carbon Black Cloud at the end of the day is a true multi-tenant next generation security cloud. Security has been moving more and more to cloud delivered frameworks. We'll talk about some of the benefits of doing that in a little bit as we walk through the presentation. But at the end of the day, one of the core value propositions is the fact that you're dealing with widespread large amounts of data, petabyte scale data, and you're looking across a number of different customers at any given time and seeing trillions of events per day processed in the cloud. So just a snapshot of Carbon Black Cloud as it exists today. Over 10 million endpoints are protected in the Carbon Black Cloud. These are endpoints and/or workloads. We process 1 trillion security events per day. So these are things that we evaluate, look for malicious activity for, connect and analyze together in order to understand attacker behavior. And ultimately what you get is the benefit across 20,000 customers, getting that level of visibility and analysis, and basically leveraging the data, collective data across all of our tenants in order to be able to provide next generation prevention and detection. And that feedback loop can be enormously valuable, right? So the more you're able to analyze large scales of data, the more that you're able to provide, stay one step ahead of where the attackers are trying to get to. Now, as it relates to workload security, we think about the world of security through a set of control points. At the end of the day, what you need to do with security is get as much visibility as possible into the areas where attackers might be manipulating or changing or taking advantage of your environment. Almost always that relies on some control point, usually an agent, a sensor of some kind. In the context of an endpoint, you deploy agents out to endpoints. When you think about networks, you deploy network taps and you try to get some visibility into network behavior through network taps. So you need some level of visibility and control, and you need to get some level of view into how the infrastructure is behaving. When we look at workloads in cloud on the bottom left, in many ways they behave very similarly to the way an endpoint behaves. You need to, usually install sensors in those environments. In most cases, they're running full-fledged operating systems, whether they're Windows or Linux operating systems. But as you start to get more into modern application frameworks, things like container environments, serverless environments, even platform as a service environments or public cloud environments, getting these control point visibility areas, easily installing sensors, understanding how the application is behaving is becoming harder and harder, number one. And even in cases where you can deploy agents, you don't necessarily want to be subjected to the level of performance impact or concern with running an agent in an operating system the way you are with an endpoint. So at the end of the day, the core message here is workloads typically require a slightly different methodology for getting control. And we'll talk about that as we go through. Now, when we think about use cases, and this goes for any endpoint or any workload, there's kind of three areas that you need to solve from a security perspective when you're trying to protect your critical assets. The first is around identification of risk. This is an area where specifically for workloads, it becomes even more important because workloads themselves are administrator controlled systems. They don't have a lot of variability in their behavior, meaning that you should be able to tie them back to a better known set of well understood behavior. And therefore, you should be able to monitor that environment for configuration risk, vulnerability risk, baseline the behavior first. So before you even get to an attacker prevention, detection, and response mode, you should be able to identify as much risk as possible in the system and harden that risk down to as minimal as possible whenever you can. That is a big core tenet of Carbon Black Workload. We'll show that when we walk through the value proposition and the demo, both for traditional applications and modern applications. The notion of being able to understand compliance, understand baseline configuration, understand vulnerabilities, and really give the power to administrators to take action on those things and ultimately reduce risk, we believe is a core first tenet to delivering good workload security. And we'll showcase that as we go. The second is around prevention. So, it'd be nice if we lived in a perfect world. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. You would like to reduce risk down to zero, but attackers have become really good at getting around any level of risk reduction that we have in the infrastructure. And ultimately, at the end of the day, sometimes you just may have a misconfiguration or you may have an unpatched vulnerability, right? So, this is the area where prevention, detection, and response, basically giving you that safety net of protection so that if a risk has not been mitigated and the attacker is able to get in, what can I do to harden the environment, look for malicious activity, prevent malicious action, and that can either be in the form of a malware-driven attack. What I mean by that is someone using a malicious file, or a non-malware attack, which is, could be somebody using PowerShell scripts or other allowed applications of behavior on devices and using those non-malicious applications in a malicious way. When you think about next generation antivirus and next generation prevention, it really encompasses those two things, malware-based attacks and behavioral-based attacks, especially when you deal with the data center. Usually by the time an attacker has gotten past your perimeter defenses, they've gotten past, the firewalls and the other controls that you have at the edge of your data center, the odds of them just taking a piece of commodity malware and running that, exploiting that on a server environment, a workload environment, are pretty slim. It happens every once in a while, but at that point, the attacker is smart enough to do what we refer to as living off the land. And try to stay, underneath the detection mechanisms and perform some level of data exfiltration. So this notion of being able to look at behavior very, very clearly, very distinctly, and use that behavior in sometimes a preventative policy is an important step to protecting workloads. It's super important on endpoints as well, but it's also extremely important with workloads. And then the third leg in the stool here is detection and response, which is really about how do I get better forensic information? How do I get more detail? You know, there's not going to be every type of attacker activity that you're going to create a prevention policy or prevention model around. Again, it would be nice if you can do that, but you know, in certain cases, in order not to disrupt the operations of a machine, you can't always take preventative action and preventative policy. So there are times where you need to do more detection of attacker behavior, get forensic trails of evidence to be able to kind of zoom in to see and look at attacker activity, but also zoom out and kind of see a campaign across a set of assets. Carbon Black has, you know, pretty much invented the endpoint detection and response market. We were the first to deliver endpoint detection and response and have been considered a leader in that space for quite some time now. Inside the Carbon Black cloud, you know, the enterprise EDR capability, you know, really provides full comprehensive visibility into pretty much every event that's occurring on a device, and gives you the ability to look at that in the light of attacker behavior, things like watch lists, but then also take action, you know, respond where necessary, and take the required actions in order to be able to remediate the threat in the beginning. So in a traditional environment, all of these categories ultimately make up a set of tools that you need to deliver in order to provide comprehensive protection and attacker prevention on an environment, right? So you break up all of these categories, and ultimately what you're left with is a set of tools that you have to go out and deploy. And unfortunately, right, the status quo in the security industry is each one of these tools, like I mentioned in the beginning, the first thing that they have to do is go out and install their control point, figure out a way in which they're going to get access to data, and figure out a way in which they're going to get access to control and behavior. And 99 times out of 100, that usually relies on some agent being installed inside the operating system and some place in which you have to get visibility. So what you're probably dealing with, and you know, this is what customers deal with all the time that we speak to, is agent sprawl, where especially on your servers, you're giving up valuable real estate to all of these security agents that have to be installed and have to be run inside the customer's environment.
Hey, Chris, I have a question. How does this affect the workload inside of the environment with all of these agents going on?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. So ultimately, right, everything that you have to run inside of an operating system, what it's doing is it's trying to access the same data, right? So think of an event that occurs on an endpoint or a workload, a file trying to load into memory, and a file trying to execute. That singular event, ultimately, every one of these tools is trying to hook and see and register on those events to try to make their own security determination on whether that event is good or bad. When you start to stack a set of agents, right, sometimes 10, 12, 13 agents on workloads, all of them registering on the same set of events inside the endpoint or workload, what you're doing is you're basically just, you know, killing system resources ultimately by having just repetitive actions. You know, the operating system has to report these events to every agent that's installed and registered to get this level of data and notification. And ultimately what you're doing is just wasting a bunch of assets on your environment in order to serve the needs of all these different security products. So what you tend to see is a stacking, I'll call it a stacking behavior, where the operating system performance starts to degrade even more as you start to deploy more and more agents inside the operating system. I mean, and as it relates to workloads, you're robbing yourself of critical application processing on the CPU. You're robbing yourself of critical memory. In many cases, that can be that can actually affect your bottom line, because if you look at the way customers try to deploy virtual machines in the data center, they try to get as much utilization as possible in the data center. So the more capacity, compute capacity that you're taking up for security tools, unfortunately, the less compute capacity you have for your core applications, right? And you wind up paying more for your core compute. So that's really the problem here, which is the stacking of security tools creates significant performance degradation. And ultimately, it's just a pain for people to manage, right? Because they have to manage all of these different agents.
Right.
So the primary value proposition of the Carbon Black Cloud is really the consolidation of these agents and the consolidation of these use cases into a single sensor, single data stream, single backend platform environment, right? So again, this is the power of leveraging a cloud platform to really deliver security in a holistic way. As soon as we have data coming off of an endpoint, as soon as we have that control point on an endpoint or a workload, we're then able to use the same backend system, have a single data stream coming off of that environment, that workload, and then stack the use cases, whether it's endpoint detection or response, or next generation antivirus, or vulnerability management. Those use cases can be delivered as a service inside of the SaaS console, leveraging the same data stream, versus having to go out and install separate agents, separate sensors in every environment. And again, this rings true for any place, whether you're doing this on an endpoint or a workload. But as you start to look at where it provides the most value, having a single sensor, single data stream, and easing the management burden on workloads, as we mentioned before, it takes a heightened importance, right? Just given the criticality of those environments. And like I mentioned in the beginning, you're dealing now with trillions of events being centralized into a single cloud backend system. That centralization of data allows you to perform a lot of analytics on that information. So again, the benefit of having that petabyte scale data on the backend is you can now use data techniques that previously couldn't necessarily be done if you were trying to have siloed environments at every single customer, because in those cases, there's typically not enough data volume in a single tenant in order to be able to run true analytic and correlation based techniques. And this is a fairly recent phenomenon. So I would say, it wasn't until maybe 5 years ago that cloud backend, public cloud backend environments were able to handle this level of data at scale and do it in a way that was cost effective, such that you can deliver endpoint and workload security at the price point that customers expect, and do it in a reliable fashion, and effectively leverage the cloud platforms as scaling mechanisms in order to handle data at this volume. So I would say this is a relatively new kind of trend in the security space. There's obviously been a few vendors who have led that trend, but we're still, I think, in the infancy of a lot of the adjustment and changes of the cloud being used as a tool in the security arsenal, the same way that it's been used as a tool in other environments like sales and marketing applications where you deal with large amounts of information. I think in these cases, security is more and more starting to trend over into being a cloud delivered service for all the reasons that we mentioned before. So that's all good and great, given the ability to leverage, I'll call it commodity off-the-shelf operating systems. And like I mentioned, all of those value propositions exist any place that Carbon Black runs, whether they're running on an operating system on an endpoint, or whether they're running on an operating system in your data center or in the public cloud. Now, given that we're part of VMware, and VMware is ultimately a data center operating system company, and we provide, virtual compute, what are the things that we can do differently? The first, and I think most important, is I mentioned all the reasons that Carbon Black provides the benefit of creating a single sensor and single data stream model. But when you're dealing with vSphere environments, we can actually remove completely the burden of agent deployment and agent lifecycle management. And we'll show this live, but the way in which we do this is we actually leverage the core virtualization layer, meaning the thing that runs underneath the operating system. So think about virtualization as being that software layer that sits in between hardware in your data center and the virtual compute environment, the operating systems that are running inside the virtual machines, we can leverage that virtualization layer as the place that can host and deliver the security tooling to your virtual data centers. And again, given where VMware has gone as a company, that can be virtualization and VMware infrastructure running on-prem, or it could be VMware infrastructure running in public clouds, like we have with VMware Cloud, the VMC product, which today runs across AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So that benefit of basically taking all of those use cases that I described and turning it into a single enablement button inside the vSphere software layer is enormously powerful, because it takes an even greater burden off of managing and deploying agents, and ultimately can run security tooling in a more secure way, because the virtualization layer is kind of acting as a protection mechanism. It can run it in a more secure way than what you can do if you were running just a standard agent inside the OS. So we'll showcase that, but that's a huge benefit. The second is around helping you identify a greater deal of vulnerabilities and a greater deal of potential risk in the system, and giving you more information about how critical those vulnerabilities are. So again, this is an area where a lot of security tools fall short. They tend to focus only on the threat landscape. They tend to focus only on the attack landscape. That is important. That is something that we want to do. But ultimately, when you're dealing with workloads in particular, we want to be able to identify vulnerabilities as early as possible in the life cycle, give you clear and well understood direction on how risky those are, and then align that information on the third point so that the IT administrators, the people that are usually responsible for patching, are actually using the same data and working off the same information as your security operations team. Again, we'll show that as we go through the demo. So what we did with the Workload Security product is we took the base set of offerings that Carbon Black provides today, these things across the top: audit remediation, NGAV, EDR, managed detection, and we expanded that out, and this was announced at VMworld this year, to include new sets of functionality on the top, specifically vulnerability management and something that we refer to as workload visibility, just getting better insight into workloads. And in addition, expanded that out on the bottom to include virtual machine environments, so VMware environments, where it's actually built right into vCenter, as well as core security for container environments, things that are running on top of Kubernetes, where you can actually deliver security for modern applications.
Hey, Chris, what about non-vSphere environments, physical servers? How does that extend out?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. So, prior to the Carbon Black acquisition, or prior to Carbon Black becoming part of VMware, we had a number of tools that provided, I'll call it, purpose-built security for virtual machines, and enabled you to deliver security for your vSphere environment, kind of leveraging the virtual infrastructure. But we didn't have that, I'll call it, that horizontal ubiquity to be able to deliver that same set of functionality across any device, anywhere, when you weren't running VMware. So the Carbon Black, just given the fact of Carbon Black's history, that it comes from a endpoint security mindset, and it comes from a, I'll call it a CISO mindset of horizontal support first. We have the ability of covering any environment on the bottom, any Windows, Mac, Linux operating system, anything running in your core public cloud environments, Azure, Google Cloud, or AWS natively, that isn't necessarily running VMware. All of those things can be covered by just simply deploying the Carbon Black Cloud Sensor into those operating systems. And the data gets reported back into the Carbon Black Cloud, the same multi-tenant Carbon Black Cloud, in the exact same way as if you were running an agentless capability with vSphere. So the main benefit from a ubiquity perspective with Carbon Black is the fact that we can always get to the point of deploying a sensor on your operating system and effectively get the same set of use cases along the top, whether that environment is running within a VMware context or without a VMware context. So we feel strongly that you're able to kind of solve this problem holistically, no matter where your workloads might be running. Okay, so So like I mentioned at VMworld this year, we announced this notion of securing workloads. It's built around these three tenets that I mentioned before: identification of risk, prevention, detection, and response. It's worth noting on the left-hand side, we've built in full vulnerability management and what we call audit and remediation, the ability to get configuration data, perform scanless vulnerability management on any workload. So you don't have to scan file systems, you don't have to deploy Nessus scans, you don't have to deploy any of these other third-party scanners into your environment. That whole notion of paying for vulnerability scans as well as using agents for vulnerability scans in those environments is completely gone. Prioritization and reporting on vulnerabilities is built into Carbon Black Workload. That scales up into full prevention and detection and response. So, again, with the flip of a switch inside a vCenter, you can do things on the left, but you can also go all the way up to having full-scale prevention, the same NJAV style prevention that we provide across the board, as well as full-scale EDR. So if you wanted to start pulling data for forensic purposes, run watch lists, feed that data back into your SIM system, perform kind of advanced analytics and remediation on that data, all of this is kind of built in to a single data stream coming off of your workloads, integrated into your vSphere environment specifically through a plugin into vCenter, where you can easily flip on this workload security capability directly inside of vCenter and effectively provide this agentless activation. And that can be done through vCenter, but it can also be done through the Carbon Black Cloud console. And Evan will showcase that as we get into the demo. So we're going to show this live, so I'm not going to dive into this too much. Just to give you, orient you around what you're going to see live is you're going to see the vCenter plugin, which again provides you this ability to do a one-click enablement for any virtual machine inside your inventory. You're also going to see this reporting on vulnerabilities directly inside of vCenter. And again, the scoring at the top is the critical piece to remember here. There's no scans that you have to run. There's no additional sensors you have to deploy. This is all built right in to the core capability of Carbon Black Workload. And we provide not just a list of CVEs, but also those CVEs based on risk scoring, sophisticated risk scoring that's actually powered by Kenna Security, which, in most cases, people are buying separately in order to deliver prioritization for their vulnerabilities. But that scoring system is built right in to what Carbon Black Cloud offers. In addition, Evan's going to walk through the how that data looks inside the Carbon Black Cloud. So, again, we're mirroring that information across what people see on the IT administration side, as well as what people see on the security side. So in Carbon Black Cloud, we provide the same view of vulnerabilities, but we also provide the ability to run custom queries and configuration management. This is through a mechanism that we call Live Query, where you can go out and basically schedule queries to run. We have a set of pre-canned queries that we provide to get configuration data, but then you can also create any custom query that you want to be able to deliver in order to get certain configuration information. And this can be super valuable, especially as it relates to compliance requirements on your workloads. And then ultimately, like I mentioned, all of this scales into the full powerful backend of threat detection, response, and prevention policy. So we're not going to really detail that or showcase that too much today. We're not going to showcase any live attack behavior, but just keep in mind that this idea of workload security, the powerful point of how this is delivered in Carbon Black Cloud is we take a lot of those risk reduction activities and we align it and hug it very close together with the threat prevention and detection and response capability. So like I mentioned, anytime you flip the switch inside of vCenter to turn on workload security, or anytime you deploy this in a public cloud environment, you're getting all of this rich threat activity, remediation, and prevention policy that's backed by NJAV and EDR. All right, so I'm going to hand the ball over to Evan, and he's going to run through this live just to give you a sense of how it looks.
All right. I gotta find my name. See my screen?
I do not.
I can see your screen, Evan. You're good.
Okay, perfect. All right, so like Chris was saying, it all begins with enabling Carbon Black inside of the workload, and we'll do that by going into vCenter, clicking on this Enable Carbon Black button. We can also do it at scale and enabling the sensor, providing different configuration files for the different operating systems and separate policies. But once we have that deployed, we can go right into the Carbon Black plugin and get a good sense of, hold on. I'm scrolling up. All right. Get a good sense of what's available and what I can see from a vulnerability perspective inside of the environment. So I can see what my affected assets are, how many vulnerabilities do I have. They're categorized by operating system and applications that are deployed on inside of those workloads. And then looking at the criticality, like Chris stated before, that criticality becomes very important when it comes to mitigating risk inside of your workloads. You can see the CVSS score provided, but also that risk score provided by Kenna, looking at the actual exploitability of that CVE, meaning is it available out on GitHub so I can download that code and execute it inside of that operating system and get some type of escalated privileges or shell inside of the OS. So we can see here, you know, this one specifically around that Active Directory vulnerability that just came out. We could see the risk details and where it's easily exploitable, and then the CVS details tied to that as well, and then the effect that when it comes to the actual asset that has that vulnerability. And then as we proceed to provide that same visibility to security, right, we could see the same Windows operating system here, and then looking at the vulnerabilities that exist the same way, and looking at what that risk score is provided to the security team, so that way they can create a preventative policy for it or a compensating control if you can't patch that system automatically, right? And then moving further, as we have that sensor already deployed inside of the operating system, we can go ahead and then leverage the querying mechanism to look at different options as to how that environment can run, if there's any configuration drift, or there's any additional vulnerabilities that we may want to mitigate. So such as like Eternal Blue, which has been used in many ransomware attacks. I can leverage the query mechanism to see what assets have SMB version 1 status enabled, and then I can go ahead and either remediate that within the operating system, or go ahead and go patch my golden images to ensure compliance inside of my environment.
Awesome.
Pass it back to you, Chris.
So yeah, so like I mentioned, I think the cool thing here is really about how we can align that view across the IT administrator and the security team, and really the ability for them to work off of the same sets of information, you know, between the tools that they're most comfortable in. You know, IT administrators don't have access to backend security tooling, but yet they're usually the ones that have to responsible for things like patching the environment, reducing vulnerability risk, changing configuration data. So this idea that, you know, providing them that information natively in the place in which they're most likely to consume it, which is, you know, the tool like vCenter, you know, can really help close that loop as quickly as possible. And then I think the whole reduction of sort of sensor management and sensor deployment tremendously powerful.
Yep.
So lastly, before we take questions, I just want to talk a little bit about modern workloads, right? So clearly, as we start to move into you know, more public cloud and modern application environments, you're getting less and less of the ability of doing any level of, I'll call it, operating system-based management and detection, right? So the trend lines here are pretty clear. You know, as we start to look out, you know, in the next 5 years, you're going to see more and more environments, more and more applications running on top of containerized infrastructure, as well as starting to have a more DevOps-centric approach to how they deliver applications. Just to give you an internal story, you know, we're in the process of updating all of our Carbon Black Cloud infrastructure. Again, this is an application that serves 20,000 customers, millions of endpoints. It was probably various services in the cloud were running on Kubernetes. We're in the process of updating the entire cloud backend to be fully delivered via Kubernetes infrastructure. The expectation is early next year it'll be an entirely Kubernetes focused backend cloud platform. And that's not, I don't think that's a singular, I don't think that's unique to us, right? I think every customer that has any level of application that is serving business requirements, business needs, will ultimately start to look at modernizing that infrastructure or modernizing that application stack to be delivered via Kubernetes. So what does that mean from a security perspective, and what does that mean for securing your environment, right? So if I consider workload in the context of I want to secure everywhere that I have critical apps and critical data, what should I do if I start to see applications be delivered via Kubernetes? Well, unfortunately, the Kubernetes stack introduces a new kind of paradigm in the way in which workloads are delivered. Right, so you have the data center, you have infrastructure, but ultimately that infrastructure is not as aware of the applications that are running on top of it. Instead, what you have is a quote unquote orchestration layer, something that is responsible for maintaining the surface area of the application and maintaining the footprint of the application, and ultimately manipulating hardware resources in order to deliver the application appropriately. And then inside of that orchestration layer, you have containers, which are actually, think of those as your compute capacity or compute nodes. And you have the code itself, which is actually running inside of the container to deliver the application. Now, as it relates to a security perspective, the container itself does have some risk and does have some security profile that you have to manage. Most notably, you have to ensure that it's not running any particular vulnerability, or I'm not delivering vulnerabilities into production by grabbing an off-the-shelf container that has a known vulnerability. You do have to make sure that those containers are running with the appropriate permissions, not necessarily allowing them to run with root privilege, not necessarily allowing them to communicate in an unrestricted manner. And obviously not necessarily allowing them to execute malicious software. So in those cases, right, there's a set of things that you have to be able to do inside of the container itself in order to be able to provide security and I'll call it an analogous way to what you would want to do is as if you were running an operating system, right? And the big difference is how early in the life cycle can I control the introduction of that risk. But at the end of the day, you're still trying to solve similar problems, which is reduce vulnerabilities, reduce misconfiguration, and not allow malicious activity to run. Now, the complicated factor here is the Kubernetes layer, this unified infrastructure API. If you think about that Kubernetes orchestration bucket that we've blown up here, introduces a new set of security risks, right? It introduces the notion of provisioning load balancers, provisioning the network, provisioning role-based access and secret privilege, allowing remote access in and out of containers. That Kubernetes layer itself, regardless of how you protect the container, provides some potential opportunity for misconfiguration, some potential opportunity for a vulnerable config, some potential opportunity for security risk. So in order to properly solve that security challenge, you have to be able to not just focus on container behavior, but also focus on the Kubernetes Orchestrator itself. It's a pretty powerful mechanism. It effectively has full control over your entire application stack. And given that level of power, it produces a lot of potential risk. Your developers want to be able to have direct hands-on access to the Kubernetes layer. I mean, that's what they use effectively to run their applications at scale. So when you do that, it starts to create an increased amount of dependency on different profiles, these DevOps personas, but it also starts to create a lot of complexity in how your applications communicate to each other, how traffic communicates, and it's not as easily tracked to a kind of a single sensor type of environment. So for security teams, and I hear security teams all the time, see this kind of risk coming or see this, this wave coming, but unfortunately today do not have a lot of tools at their disposal in order to be able to solve this challenge. And there's been a set of container security tools that have been out there that focus a lot on vulnerabilities. They tend to, I'll call it, sell into the DevOps organizations and kind of put the burden on the DevOps organizations to provide their own security. But ultimately, if you're application owners, you're not necessarily concerned about security on a day-to-day basis. You're usually concerned about operations, uptime, performance. So you really need security to own a lot of these use cases. And ultimately, our belief is by providing embedded modern application security inside of the Carbon Black Cloud console and inside of Carbon Black Workload, we have the ability of actually creating a much more aligned and integrated workflow for our customers so that the security team can really take back control of ensuring that these modern application frameworks are secure. And we do that throughout the entire life cycle. So, I mentioned, how Kubernetes requires you to do a little bit more upfront to control things at the build and deploy phase. Inside of Carbon Black Cloud, we have a capability that we call guardrails, which includes container image scanning, which allows you to look at the misconfigurations, the compliance risk, the configuration risk, as well as the vulnerabilities of containers being introduced, and do all that prior to an application being deployed. And we can do all of that without deploying a single agent, right? So basically, just by looking at your image repository, just by looking at the Kubernetes API layer, we can determine how risky a configuration is and also reduce the ability for application teams to deploy anything that might introduce additional risk. And then we back that up with full runtime security. So basically, where you do need to actually deploy what we call node guard out to environments where the Kubernetes nodes themselves are being monitored for runtime behavior, effectively integrating that runtime behavior into our prevention and detection and response workflow so that a customer is looking at behavior across the board and they can filter that behavior based on whether they want to see endpoints, whether they want to see workloads that are running inside of a Windows operating system, or whether they want to see behavior coming off of your Kubernetes infrastructure. And that centralization, that sort of ubiquity that we can provide across any infrastructure, we think is super powerful and exactly what security teams are looking for, which is, give them less tools in order for them to be able to provide detection and response across the board. I see there's a hand raised, but I actually don't know how to take action on that. So. Okay, so these are the use cases I described with Carbon Black Workload for Kubernetes. And the key point I'd take away here is just keep in mind that when we talk about workload security, our thought process is you have to think about this in a holistic way. You have to future-proof your infrastructure and the choices you make around securing your infrastructure to provide security for environments that you have running today, which could be your on-premises applications running inside of a Windows operating system, your public cloud instances that might be running traditional instances in public cloud, but also things that are running in modern application frameworks. And this Kubernetes functionality works, like I mentioned before, any place where Kubernetes might be running. It could be, the Elastic Kubernetes service from Amazon. It could be, Google Cloud. It could be on-prem Kubernetes. It could be vSphere delivered Kubernetes. Wherever you might be running Kubernetes Stack, this functionality is available. So like I mentioned, just to recap, and then we'll get to questions, we're super excited about the Carbon Black Workload functionality. Ultimately, our goal is to provide, we call intrinsic security, security as close to zero footprint as possible, anywhere where you might be running workloads. And as a part of VMware, we think we're uniquely positioned to solve this problem. VMware, like I mentioned, has infrastructure footprint across private cloud environments, that are running traditional applications, traditional operating systems, private cloud environments that are running Kubernetes with our VMware Tanzu stack, as well as public cloud infrastructure. And we're seeing more and more adoption of VMware Cloud, where people can run VMware software on top of their public cloud infrastructure. All of that virtual compute layer provides us a really unique ability to create intrinsic security, click of a button security, things that you can really embed into the entire application stack. And that's really where Carbon Black Cloud plays, and we think it can make a tremendous difference in sort of really securing critical assets inside of our customer environment. So just a few places to learn more. Obviously, you can look at some of the written materials and look at the data sheet, as well as blogs and introduce Carbon Black Workload. Again, all of this came out at VMworld this year, which was all virtual, but there's a lot of great on-demand content that you can take a look at in the VMworld sessions to be able to see a lot of these capabilities live. You can also just reach out to your sales contacts and request a live demo, and we can run through a full live demo for your environment. The other thing I want to mention is we are providing a free trial to any vSphere customer to be able to try what we call Workload Essentials, which is basically all the things that Evan showed, the vulnerability management, the live query, and the ability of prioritizing that vulnerability through the vCenter plugin. All of that's available for free for an unlimited amount of workloads until April 2021. So take advantage of that free trial. It's there's no requirement to sign up for anything, and you're not actually you're not inserting any payment prior to the trial being over. So it's a pretty no strings attached trial to be able to take a look at it, and it's a great way to get kick the tires and see how this can operate inside your environment. So with that, we will take some questions.
Yep, I have a question here. Is it vulnerability management in its entirety, or is it just giving context to the vCenter ops team in respect to vulnerabilities and risk?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you mean by in its entirety. It's I'll call it vulnerability discovery and vulnerability identification in its entirety, meaning that we are identifying, we're taking the data that we collect off a device, and independently of anything else having to run on that device, identifying, reporting, and giving you prioritization on that vulnerability. And that could be for an operating system vulnerability or an application running on the environment. Now, vulnerability management tools, in many cases, they'll tie into patching systems, they'll tie into ticketing systems, they'll provide you ways of workflow around a vulnerability in order to be able to remediate. Admittedly, a lot of other vulnerability tools might have those integrations where we haven't necessarily built those out yet. So depending on whether that's what you mean by full vulnerability management, but in the context of really identifying, discovering, and reporting on a vulnerability in earnest without anything else having to run, it's a full stack solution from that perspective.
Nice. Will we be able to do on-demand scanning for specific vulns of interest?
You can do on-demand scanning, so you can certainly scan infrastructure anytime that you want, or request that the infrastructure configuration data be pulled anytime you want. You can also look for specific applications. So if you were concerned about a particular hash or another application that you were felt there was a vulnerability associated with, you can always perform using the tools in the Carbon Black Cloud. Always look at those vulnerabilities or look for that hash or that indicator to determine whether there was something critical there. I don't know another mechanism in which you'd want to look for any vulnerability of interest, but we do provide searching and reporting if you wanted to look for a specific CVE number or if you wanted to look for a particular hash.
Yeah, and I think leveraging live query too, if you're aware of the certain actions that can happen inside of the operating system, you can leverage live query to look for that. specific button.
Okay, so a lot of these were answered in chat. Hypervisor protection. So yeah. So just chat about hypervisor protection quickly. So we're obviously leveraging some portion of the hypervisor in order to be able to deliver security to the guest VMs running above the hypervisor. And the ways in which the reason that we can do that is, the hypervisor is considered what we refer to as a separate attack domain, meaning that it's if you compromise a virtual machine running inside of a virtual data center, you haven't necessarily compromised the hypervisor itself. In fact, 99.9% of the cases have not done that, if not 100% of the cases. So yes, it's a valid thing to be able to look at hardening of the hypervisor itself, but given where most of the attack surface exists, meaning that most of where applications are being installed, vulnerabilities exist, and I'll call it the attack surface is most dangerous, which is the running operating system above that. That's really the first and most critical place that you need to be able to protect in order to manage the risk inside your data center. Now, the hypervisor itself, it clearly has its own set of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. We report on those vulnerabilities. We did have a feature in a product called App Defense where we reported on hypervisor vulnerabilities that should be patched. That's something that we're looking to bring into Carbon Black Workload as well. It's not currently there today. And in addition, we are looking at deploying, I'll call it detection and response workflow embedded into vSphere, into the ESX host itself. But just given the performance footprint, we haven't kind of rolled out a generic agent for someone to run inside the vSphere host. But that is something we're looking at. But in general, think about the vSphere security layer as using a lot of the hardened techniques that we provide inside of vSphere, and Carbon Black Cloud providing most of the value proposition for running workloads on top of vSphere. There's a question about Saltstack. So I think in the context of modern applications, Saltstack I think can be leveraged. I'll say it's very new, right? Saltstack into the family at VMware, but when you're running Kubernetes and containers, the notion of leveraging tools like Saltstack to be able to automate, configuration and infrastructure changes at mass can be quite valuable. So I would look at it all as the more that we can integrate into your core operational workflow and make security part of that feedback loop, the better off we'll be. And that's really where we think Saltstack will fit from a security perspective. There's obviously a lot of infrastructure operational benefits there, but from a security perspective, it's really about aligning a lot of the risks that we can find inside a Carbon Black Cloud workload with how you remediate that risk via automation.
Let's see. Does the trial cover on-premise installations?
The trial absolutely does, yeah. I mean, when you talk about on-prem installations, we're talking about Carbon Black being installed on-prem. No, if you're talking about vSphere being installed on-prem, yes. So if you have an on-prem vSphere environment, you can easily have Carbon Black Cloud protecting that environment through the free trial or through a paid version. Carbon Black Cloud eventually replaced CB Protect and CB Response. Yes, the answer is yes there. So we already have, as it relates to CB Response, which is our on-prem EDR product, we already have a feature in Carbon Black Cloud, or a set of features called Enterprise EDR, used to be called Threat Hunter, which actually encompasses pretty much all of the capability that CB Response offered for on-prem EDR. And just given the data intensity of EDR, my personal opinion is that, that'll be a cloud delivered solution in general across the board. Like, you won't see a lot of continued on-prem EDR deployments, right, going forward. Mostly because the data volume is just getting too high. It's hard for people to manage. It's a lot easier for us to manage that as a service. So there's mechanisms that we provide for customers to migrate from on-prem EDR to Carbon Black Cloud. Now for CB Protect, which is the app control least privilege tool, we currently don't have that inside of Carbon Black Cloud. It's something that we're considering. My guess is like that's going to be more than a year journey for us to build that feature set into Carbon Black Cloud. Directionally, we want to do that, but in neither of those cases, right, is support for the on-prem products going away. So ideally, we can centralize all of these use cases into Carbon Black Cloud, but we do think, at least for EDR, that's the best place to start at the moment.
Cool.
So there's a question about tagging a vulnerability with a coworker's name. Short answer with that is yes, through other integrated offerings. So like we have a lot of API integrations and workflow integrations with Carbon Black Cloud in general. Some of those hook into SIM systems, some of those hook into other, I'll call it SOAR-like mechanisms. And then we're also working on a ServiceNow integration on Carbon Black Cloud. So the workflow for, I'll call it, tagging or remediating or taking action is done through third-party integrations with Carbon Black Cloud and or API driven with the backend. Okay, there's a question about technical counterpart in the UK. There's a few of them, so I can't really answer that with a high level of fidelity. But if you just reach out to that demo email address that was there before, we should be able to get you somebody. I can't see this last one. Carbon Black Cloud, generate custom security posture dashboard on. Yeah. So short answer on this is the dashboard, Carbon Black Cloud Console does not have a customizable dashboard. It does have an export feature on the dashboard to be able to report data or provide an easy reporting structure to senior management. But it doesn't currently have customizable dashboard widgets. We are working on a dashboard refresh. We expect the dashboard to be rehashed or revamped in February, which might include some customization options. But ultimately, the reporting functionality is really driven off of exporting the dashboard capability.
Awesome.
All right, we're right at time.
We're right at time. And with that being said, I would like to thank you, Chris, for presenting such an excellent presentation.
All right,
and
awesome.
everyone, the recording will be sent out.
All right, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.